If we think about security, it is not too long before that we think about hacking and hackers. Unfortunately, hackers and the word hack itself have too often been associated with malevolent activity. While it is true that the etymological origin of the word is quite literally cut into pieces, it is also true that it has come to define something that is maybe inelegant but effective, and in some cases something that is innovative. However, when it pertains to security, hacking almost always seems to indicate nefarious activity. But then I'm reminded of Stephen Levy's classic, which is titled Hackers, and its subtitle, more importantly, was Heroes of the Computer Revolution. I argue that even in security, there are hackers who are heroes, and there are hackers who aren't.
Welcome to White Hat Security's AppSec Stats Flash, the monthly podcast on the state of application security. Hosted by Setu Kulkarni with analysis from White Hat's in-house security expert, Zach Jones. Today's special guest is Casey Ellis, founder and CTO of Bugcrowd.
Before we get into the hackers or heroes conversation, let's have a look at the state of application security today. First up is window of exposure. As a quick reminder, window of exposure is a percentage measure of the applications that have exploitable serious vulnerabilities. We track window of exposure at an industry level for the trailing 12 months. We started this year with manufacturing, if you remember, having the highest window of exposure, a little over 70%. However, we have seen that the window of exposure for manufacturing has dropped from 70% to 63% over the last couple of months. What that really means is when we started the year, nearly 70% of all applications in manufacturing had at least one exploitable serious vulnerability open throughout the year. That number today has dropped down to 63%. Clearly, it seems like the focus on manufacturing and supply chain security is having a positive impact on the window of exposure enterprise-wide. The other encouraging trend here is in healthcare. We see that the window of exposure for healthcare is also continuously improving over the last few months. Window of exposure for healthcare apps is down from 59% at the beginning of the year to 52% last month. But make no mistake, these are still very high numbers. 63% of all manufacturing apps and 52% of all healthcare apps have at least one serious exploitable vulnerability open throughout the year. It's not a question of if these apps will be breached. It's a question of when. However, the improving trends in both manufacturing and healthcare point to increased focus and increased investment in application security within these sectors. Now, we do have a concerning data point that we've discovered in last month's data. I must clarify, this is not a trend yet, this is just a data point, and this data point is in the utilities sector. Over the last 3 months, we've seen an almost 7-fold increase in the number of applications that have been onboarded into application security with White Hat. So there is a significant increase of applications that are being subject to application security testing. Also, remember the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident that is fresh in our minds. And more importantly, what I'd like to point out here is application-specific attacks are equally, if not more likely than ransomware. I can totally conceive a situation where an application weakness allows the installation and proliferation of ransomware, especially given the high-impact nature of ransomware in utilities. So the data point that I'm talking about is window of exposure for utilities. The applications in utilities has jumped to 67% from 65% last month and from 55% towards the beginning of this year. I want to quickly connect this data point with the call for increased investment in energy infrastructure that has been called out in President Biden's American Jobs Plan. Clearly, infrastructure investment, energy infrastructure investment, has to include cybersecurity investments. But coming back to our data, let me bring Zach in to explore this data point a little further. Zach, this trend seems to fly in the face of common sense, doesn't it? Why do you think this is the case? Is it because utility companies like manufacturing are dealing with what is classically called two-speed IT? What I mean by that is they're slapping on new applications on older application infrastructure and putting these applications out on the internet for the public to access. Is that one reason why we're seeing an increase in the window of exposure for the applications in the utility sector?
It's definitely interesting that we see, like you mentioned, a large increase over the past year of requests for new testing of applications in the utilities industry. And what we often see with any kind of new group of applications being tested is that, of course, you find a lot more vulnerabilities shortly after those applications are tested for the first time. So we don't have visibility into whether these are brand new applications in terms of new development or whether these are old applications that were never tested. But one interesting thing that we observed whenever we kind of dug into this utilities sector data was that there was a sort of coincident effort that we can observe where a portion of the vulnerabilities that were discovered shortly after these requests for new testing of these applications were remediated. But a majority of them were not remediated and have not been remediated. And so you think of those vulnerabilities basically sitting there now, having been discovered. They existed prior to having been discovered, but now they're being tracked. And so every week, every month that they continue to be in our data set, they're increasing that window of exposure, going from small group of 30 days to the next group, and then all the way eventually up to being exposed for an entire year. So that's certainly one of the factors that we're seeing played out here is the aging of these vulnerabilities. And it's an interesting opportunity to talk about a trend that we often see with organizations who are maybe less familiar with security testing and application security processes than technology industry or finance industry, healthcare industry, whereby they want to begin their security program. So they start application security testing, but it's often the case that they don't necessarily have the downstream plan of step one, let's get all of our applications tested. And then what's step two, right? And then step three is hopefully security. And so I think it speaks to that need for a vision when engaging in new security processes to plan out what the response will be to the discovery of vulnerabilities. Like I mentioned, they probably existed. They almost certainly existed prior to White Hat discovering them. But now that you know about them, there's sort of a responsibility to begin to remediate. And that's something that we often observe across industries, that there's a flurry of vulnerability discovery and a trickle of vulnerability remediation.
Quite a few strands to pull on there, Zach. But let's kind of rewind to 2.5 years ago when the infamous Struts vulnerability reared its ugly head. You remember when that happened, there was a sudden and immediate focus on analyzing and assessing application infrastructures for the presence of struts and then just really acting on it to fix it. And we saw that reflect in our data as well. We saw the number of discoveries of open source vulnerabilities spike, but at the same time, we also saw an increased focus in remediating these vulnerabilities. A few things that happened then. One, there was a lot of public exposure of the issue, right? The Struts vulnerability itself. There was a household brand name that was exposed and it was in the news. And there were the tools and infrastructure from a security perspective that were available to identify those issues. And there's some work done to put together, like you said, a vision or a plan to fix those issues. It almost seems to me that the same set of circumstances may be playing out here. We had a pretty high-profile Colonial ransomware attack, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack that made the news. President Biden's American Jobs Plan, the executive order on cybersecurity for the nation, combined with a lot more focus on the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, the electric grid that's playing out in the public sphere. I think this does create a great environment for energy companies, infrastructure companies to look at security, in particular application security, and put together a quick action plan to address the low-hanging fruit. And what I'm thinking here is, even if we look at the OWASP top 10 or the OWASP top 5 or the white hat top 10, it could be a prescription, an early prescription for energy and utility companies to look at their applications and implement some quick fixes to improve their cybersecurity posture. Any thoughts there? Do you think that makes sense?
Yeah, I think the attention helps. You mentioned the struts vulnerability, and one of the things that we commonly observed with that one was, direct evidence of executive involvement, right? Inquiries coming into White Hat saying, our CEO or our CTO or our CISO has requested that we audit for not only the struts vulnerability, but with the greater awareness, application code execution vulnerabilities in general. And we saw that drive improved remediation rates. And so it'll be certainly an interesting data point to monitor with the utilities space to see if this new awareness and the news around the colonial issue drives similar outcomes in that industry or maybe across industries going forward. But we also have to not forget that we also saw that effort around remediation of struts and application code execution come at the cost of other vulnerabilities, right? It wasn't like an overall increase in remediation. It was just a reallocation of resources. So that trend may also continue.
Absolutely, something to watch out for. Now, before we end this part of the conversation, can we draw a straight line between application security weaknesses and the potential increase of ransomware attacks? Is there a straight line that can be drawn between both those?
Well, there's certainly application layer attacks that are, in terms of vulnerabilities, that are well known for their ability to be abused for doing things like distributing malware and ransomware, right? And if we look at the top 5 white hat most likely vulnerabilities, we see that, content spoofing and cross-site scripting are 2 vulnerabilities that are well known for being easy to abuse through spear phishing campaigns, other types of social engineering in order to gain a foothold on the users of various applications to function as a pivot point. So we don't have to even go very deep in the stack of all the vulnerabilities at the application layer to find examples where applications can expose an organization to potential downstream attacks.
Totally. And I think that is the kind of mindset that hopefully the security leadership within the utility space takes as they're trying to address the ransomware issue more holistically. Drawing that straight line, that connection, that correlation with application security weaknesses is an important one. Now let's move on to the next metric that we track. This is basically not a metric, but a list of top 5 vulnerability classes that we're tracking here at White Hat. And what we've seen over the last 5 months that we've been doing so is that we have a pretty stable set of top 5 vulnerability classes, namely information leakage, insufficient transport level protection, insufficient session expiration, cross-site scripting, and content spoofing. But before I go any further, I cannot emphasize enough the positive impact we could have if we started a campaign today to vaccinate our applications against these known vulnerability types. Like I've said in the past episodes as well, it's not like we don't know what the issues are. In fact, we have a very good idea of what these issues are. These issues are the same 5 issues that we've been talking about for the last 5 months. And if we were to start a quote-unquote vaccination campaign for our applications against these 5 well-known vulnerability types, I'm pretty sure the state of application security that we report on a monthly basis would be very different. Now let's switch to a set of findings that we've not spent a lot of time talking about in the past, but I think there is an interesting finding that we have as far as serious vulnerabilities per site by class is concerned. As an example, on average, any vulnerable application that we're tracking has between 1 and 2 cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. And that has kind of sort of remained the same as have the top 5 vulnerability classes that I just spoke about. However, over the last 3 months, we have seen a spike in the number of HTTP response splitting vulnerabilities in applications. Again, a data point, not yet a trend, but a significant blip, right? It is a significant increase from an average of 1.5 HTTP response splitting vulnerabilities per site to almost 4.5 HTTP response splitting vulnerabilities per site. So let me bring Zach in. First, Zach, why don't you shed some light on this particular vulnerability before we talk about what the ramifications of this particular vulnerability are and how we could potentially have a quick fix to this.
Sure thing. First, I want to clarify so that people aren't overly alarmed with this sort of absolute number on the serious vulns per site metric. It's an important piece of context on this metric to understand that this isn't across all sites when we look at that vulnerability class. There's this filter of sites that have X vulnerability class have an average of how many, right? So it's not that all sites have, for example, in this 3 months, 4.4 HTTP response splitting vulnerabilities. It's that the population of sites that do have it have a lot of them, right? HTTP response splitting as a vulnerability is a case where the attacker is able to send input in the HTTP request that is processed by some part of the site, and then that input is returned in a portion of the HTTP response in a way that allows the attacker to inject specific characters, carriage return and line feed characters that have meaning to the browser or whatever HTTP client is processing the response to render it to the user. And what that means is the attacker can interfere with the response that the site is returning to the user. So an example of an attack scenario would be a victim visiting a malicious site that redirects them or sends a request to the vulnerable site. And then the content that the user sees of, say, a site that they trust, their bank's website or a social media website, can then be entirely hijacked by the attacker to contain the content that they want. So in many cases, this attack will give the attacker complete control of the page that the victim will view in their browser or other client that is viewing the response.
So how do we then protect applications against this kind of vulnerability? Is this a code level change that needs to be made? Or is this, again, one of those security controls in the application server that needs to be put in place?
So historically, this was a vulnerability that we would see primarily occur as the result of a developer's poor handling of user input as they manually compose an HTTP response in their code. But in modern application frameworks, developers aren't really doing that type of manual manipulation of the HTTP response. And many of the most popular modern application frameworks have been hardened, and even the languages themselves have been hardened against these attacks. So we did see historically kind of a drop off in HTTP response splitting's prevalence. But an interesting dimension that has come about as a result of the modern application deployment paradigm with containerization and things like Kubernetes is oftentimes the response that's being sent back is being controlled by several upstream components. And so recently, when we're detecting HTTP response splitting vulnerabilities, we're often seeing that the flaw is not a result of the application code itself, but is the result of something like a reverse proxy mishandling a malformed HTTP request and allowing this sort of attack. The good news in that space would be, like many of the other vulnerability classes we've discussed in previous episodes, there may be an opportunity for a more configurational based solution to this rather than having to go implement a custom code, right? It can also be that some of the configurations of these more infrastructural components are themselves dynamically parsing input in the configuration files. And so we've seen some instances of that where it's sort of a new type of code where you're writing rules for how a reverse proxy should handle HTTP requests. And in writing those rules, you've actually implemented a vulnerability. So it could be in the code, but increasingly we're seeing it at the level of an infrastructural component where this response splitting is occurring.
What this really does point out to is the increasing prevalence of vulnerabilities caused by this kind of late binding approach of not just configuration, but also potentially functional code, right? The idea that developers build out the core intellectual property, the core functionality, and basically delegate a lot of the input handling to external libraries, which in turn have a handful of configurations that need to be performed. And those configurations themselves are performed in mostly an automated manner because of the policies and the rules that have been written up already. So it looks like there is an opportunity here to look at kind of the full stack of software components that add up to delivering composite functionality. I think that's really kind of the key here, as you're pointing out. Zach, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We continue to see the DevOps picture play a role in a lot of the evolving profile of these vulnerabilities, where the ownership of management of these configurations and, say, routing of reverse proxy rules is changing in the organization. And you're going from having a handful of infrastructural components to having quite a few of them in a modern software stack and applications. And so really teams becoming experts in this full stack approach and becoming experts in the technologies involved is going to be a process that will be a learning experience for many teams. And unfortunately, when learning new technologies, we often make mistakes.
Absolutely. Now let's kind of continue our journey into a slightly more well-known realm for all of us, which is the OWASP Top 10. As you know, we've been meticulously working through the OWASP Top 10 list and providing an analysis of what we're seeing from a data point of view. So far, we've looked at A6, A3, and A5, and today we're going to do a deep dive on A2, which is broken authentication. Now, if you haven't, do listen to our analysis in the last month's episode on A5, which is broken access control, which I think is a close cousin of what we're going to discuss today, A2, broken authentication. So last time we talked about broken access control. Today we're going to talk about broken authentication. So before we dig in, I think it's a good idea to get Zach back in to get a good definition of A2, broken authentication, understand what it is, and also more critically, get the difference between A2 and A5 squared away.
So broken authentication is a case where an authentication mechanism is in place. So there is a login, there is a session, there is something to authenticate the user, but the way that it is implemented has known flaws of certain categories. This is often confused with last month's topic of broken access control. So to contrast, broken access control could be there's a functionality of a site that should be behind authentication, but isn't, right? Or it could be user A can access user B's data but once authentication has occurred. Broken authentication could be something as simple as the session of the site using predictable values for keeping the user's state authenticated to the site in a way that an attacker, say, knowing some details about the user, could guess what that authenticated session identifier would be and therefore assume their identity. The other interesting part about White Hat's profile of detection of broken authentication is that it has some reasonable granularity as opposed to broken access control, which was only in a few kind of piles of vulnerability classes at White Hat. And this is partly because a lot of our analysis of broken authentication controls is conducted during a business logic assessment in which a human attacker is going in and putting their hands on the authentication mechanisms, inspecting how they work, and going down a list of known flaws in the implementation of authentication mechanisms.
Zach, that makes sense. Let's look at broken authentication a bit more deeply. The lion's share of issues is related to insufficient session expiration. Is that something that can be fixed outside of engineering, much like HTTP response splitting? It seems like session handling is something that can easily be delegated to third-party libraries or potentially to the application infrastructure, and not necessarily controlled within the application.
There are certainly a lot of authentication frameworks or authentication handling mechanisms that are common in use amongst application developers. And in these cases, oftentimes, many of the factors, including some of the session expiration constraints, are simply configurations. And so, what we're talking about with insufficient session expiration is something that many people are probably familiar with using a large website that they have an account with, right? They log in and then they get, go get lunch in the kitchen or something like that, and they come back and the site informs them that their session is timed out and they've been logged out as a security precaution, right? And this is one of the mechanisms that we're talking about with insufficient session expiration, where a site, either by oversight or by design choice, allows a user to have a period of inactivity that lasts indefinitely. Another permutation of this vulnerability that we often see is the user clicks log out, but the site doesn't actually log them out, even though it might say that they are. So you can then later on return to the site and still be logged in. So that's another example of a vulnerability that would be reported under insufficient session expiration. So it's going to depend on the site. If you have leveraged a known implementation in your authentication mechanisms, then it may simply be a property, a configuration setting for how long the session should be allowed to be active. But if you have sort of rolled your own authentication state handling, then it may be a little bit more of an effort to go in and implement some sort of inactivity control, as well as robust controls of how the user logs out of their session.
Yeah, I think insufficient session expiration is one of those vulnerabilities where immediate attention and sufficient attention, if paid, can have a long or lasting impact on the state of application security. And I say that only because insufficient session expiration is one of the top 5 vulnerabilities we detect on a volume basis in all the applications that we assess. Now, Zach, let me kind of turn the conversation a little bit more and talk about another very pertinent topic here around authentication, and this is MFA. I'm wondering, with MFA becoming more prevalent, and again, going back to the latest executive order on cybersecurity, it looks like MFA is going to become a way of life for all of us as we deal with the federal government. How does MFA play a role here? Does it improve kind of the broken authentication issues that we see overall?
One of the ways that it certainly plays a role is, for whatever reason, when deciding to implement multi-factor authentication into their applications, it seems to be the case that organizations and developers much more frequently see that need as a reason to look for an authentication framework that can handle this. And so to go build out a profile of standards and libraries that should be used in order to implement authentication. So it's like, in order to get one feature, oftentimes they're getting potentially a more hardened overall authentication mechanism built into their applications. So I think that's certainly one benefit that you get when you go and add it. Not, of course, multi-factor authentication is giving that second check on preventing unauthorized access to the application. But it's not a silver bullet, right? We know that there are flaws with certain implementations. Multi-factor authentication through text messaging has issues, through email also has issues. So you really need to do it within the constraints of an authentication framework and ecosystem that has been hardened and is robust to various types of attacks.
Perfect. Thank you, Zach. I know we spoke about a few data points today, not necessarily trends, around the window of exposure for utilities, and also around the rise in HTTP response splitting in some of the sites that we track. Now, we're almost halfway at the halfway mark as far as our analysis for the OWASP top 10 is concerned. We've done 4 out of the 10. And I think we may just end up compiling excerpts of our podcasts about the OWASP top 10 into a summary document for the community. I think that's one more idea for us to explore, in addition to the many others that we've discussed here on the podcast over the last few months. Now, with that analysis taken care of, let's move on to the second half of this episode. However, before I do that, a quick public service announcement. We are planning to split the AppSec Stats/podcast, this particular podcast, into two separate shorter podcasts in the future. The first half of the podcast, where I analyze the state of application security with Zach, will continue as a monthly podcast with an accompanying report, as usual. The second half of the podcast, where I'm joined by a guest to discuss a topical topic or a pertinent topic, will be split out into a separate podcast by itself titled Security in the Fast Lane. What that really means is we will have two podcast drops a month, one analyzing the state of application security and the other one analyzing a topic, discussing an issue, doing a deep dive on a pertinent subject every month. With that announcement out of the way, let's take a deep dive into the mind of a hacker with Casey Ellis, the founder of Bugcrowd. I'm quite excited about the second half of today's episode. Casey Ellis, the pioneer of bug bounty as a service, is with us today, and I hope to chat with him about quite a few topics. But before we get into all that, Casey, I'd like to start off with a loaded question as I welcome you to the podcast. Who is Casey, the pen tester, the entrepreneur, and arguably a growth hacker given the roaring success of Bugcrowd, the company you founded? Tell me a little bit about your story and the inflection points in your journey, the important left and right turns that you've taken in your career that have gotten you to where you are today.
Sure thing. Well, thank you for having me on. And yeah, who is Casey? That's a great question. I ask myself the same thing from time to time, so I'll give a shot at the answer there. Basically, from a background perspective, I grew up through high school always tinkering with computers and technology. My father was a science teacher, so that was always there. I was always encouraged to do that. At the end of high school, I actually did about 6 weeks of a science degree. I was going to go into nuclear medicine, but ended up dropping out of that because it just didn't feel like the thing that I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and basically almost tripped over into a network engineering apprenticeship for a friend's startup. At which point I started, really basically hacking stuff on the job, with good intent and with permission, all those sorts of things, but just like, oh, what does this look like in the real world? And going off and getting that sort of thing done. At which point I quickly realized that, there's incredible value in being able to provide breaker feedback to enterprises and to businesses in Sydney, Australia, which is where I'm from. That's the accent that you can hear. And it all kind of went from there. So basically, pen testing for about 6 years, moved across into solutions architecture and sales. Actually, after a conversation with my wife, she sat me down at one point and said, "Hey, you computer good, but you people good too. You might not realize, but not everyone can do that. You should go try your hand out the front of the house," which I thought sounded like a good idea. And that worked out really well. At which point I got it in my head that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and basically, broke bad out of that job after a number of years. Started a consultancy and worked on various things before really hitting on the idea for Bugcrowd. Now, what is that? About 9 years ago.
Very interesting. So I think you did articulate the most important inflection point in your life, which is listening to your wife.
Yeah, it's generally good advice, I've found, in hindsight, especially.
Well done, mate.
Thank you.
Look, I've always been fascinated by this idea of the hacker mindset, right? How does a hacker think? It's very fascinating being on the outside. So I wanted to explore that at a couple of different levels with you. First, what is the hacker mindset when you're trying to break into software? So let's work on that a little bit, and then let's also try and explore the other question I have, which is, what is the hacker mindset when you're trying to crack the code for scaling your business? Obviously, you've done both. So let's start with the first aspect of the hacker mindset pertaining to hacking software.
Yeah, certainly. So Really, what I saw as the opportunity to do with Bugcrowd and almost like the fundamental nature of, I think the problem that we have in cybersecurity, like when you think about it, human vulnerability or people making decisions that leave them vulnerable, that predates the internet by a couple of thousand years. And folks looking to exploit those weaknesses or those flaws in order to gain for themselves in whatever way that might mean. That's pretty old too as a concept. So really what the internet's come and done is just sort of sped that idea up and kind of, unleashed it on the population at web scale. And it becomes our job as defenders to help people, stay ahead of that whole thing. What I was doing prior to starting Bugcrowd was running a penetration testing company in Australia. And, looking at it all, I'm thinking, okay, the math is wrong here. Like you've got this crowd of this community of, developers with different skill sets, different approaches to solving, what is fundamentally a creative problem in terms of the design and the deployment of technology. And they're all amazing, but they're all imperfect because as humans, we always are. Like we come up with amazing stuff, but sometimes we make mistakes. So that's really the nature of, I think, a lot of the time how the attack surface gets created in the first place. On the adversary side, you've got this, arguably larger group of people that have lots of different motivations, lots of different skill sets, and really more of an incentive to get a result than like a constraint around effort, based on the number of hours a day they're being paid for. In the middle of that, you've got automation, you've got, Joe and Jane, the pen tester, and those are all good things, but Joe and Jane are basically going to fail at some point to outsmart the resourcing and the economics that are available to that sort of equation, all the different failure states it can create. So really that was, going to your question about the mind of a hacker. I've grown up in the hacker community pretty much my entire life, going right back to BBS days and even, hardware hacking and different things like that, earlier in school and so on. So, I've always sort of been a part of that culture, absorbed and really fostered my own mindset as a product of that. And that's really what I knew was available. The hacker community has been basically waiting at the table for an invitation to assist in securing the internet for the better part of 30 or 40 years now, and pretty consistently been told to go away, mostly because people are scared. I think, the average person has a very good concept of the difference between a locksmith and a burglar, but the digital equivalent of that is still a fairly novel idea for a lot of folks. So, in terms of the hacker mindset, it really is about just understanding where the gaps are. Like, what are the assumptions that have been made as something's been done, or as a thing's been built, as a system's been deployed, as an action has been taken. What are the assumptions that have been put into that thing? And then what are the assumptions that have been potentially missed and have created unintentional consequences that can get an outcome that wasn't, in the original design spec? I think that's that to me is almost the true, like, the curiosity that drives wanting to answer that question for whatever particular piece of technology or tech domain you're interested in. That to me is the true essence of what a hacker actually is. It kind of got seconded into, meeting a bad person for a chunk of time there, but we're slowly wrestling the term back into its proper place. But yeah, there's your answer.
Good. So curiosity, yes, I get it, completely understand. But you said something there which kind of triggered another thought in my head, right? This idea of the disproportional economics of the whole situation, right? The adversary has pretty much, if not more, at least the same set of resources from a compute perspective, more investment, a larger community. As a hacker, I understand that we're trying to move the connotation of hacker back to the good side. Do you ever get intimidated, right? Because you're sitting here and you're trying to protect against such a large community of the adversary. Do you ever get intimidated as the hacker in trying to get your job done?
No, to be honest. And that's not a statement of, sometimes it's hard, sometimes it fails. And I think you're going to ask about the entrepreneurship side. I do see those as very similar things from like a wiring standpoint. And it's the same, the same thing's true there. Like sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. I think that the thing that's a driving force behind my own motivation is that really the question that I'm trying to answer is like, can I do this or not? And it becomes, really a matter of the exercise and the intellectual assent, the things that you get to learn in the process, and almost the sense of competing against your own capability and competing against the environment that you're trying to find ways to hack essentially. Intimidated is, I've heard people talk about it like that. So when something's really, really, a hard target and it takes a long time, it's not behaving in the way that they thought it potentially would. Definitely disappointment can probably net out to something that feels a bit like intimidation, but I've never really felt that myself.
Got it. So there is a little bit of a David and Goliath kind of a story here.
Yeah, and that's almost a driving thing. It's like this sense of being, the scrappy little dog barking at the big one. I think that's a sense that a lot of hackers that work on this stuff share, because it's an enormous task. Like when you think about just the infinite number of potential failure states in that setup that I just gave. You've got all these different developers, and then you've got all these different attackers. Like your failure states are basically n to the power of both. Applied to whatever it is that they've built and however many lines of code or whatever else might be in this. That's a lot of stuff. And from that perspective, I heard an analogy one time. Information security is a little bit like being a boxer, but the rules you fight by are basically to stay in the ring until you eventually get knocked out, while everyone else is competing with conventional boxing rules. Because between now and the heat death of the universe, I think everyone's going to basically experience some form of breach or a compromise. It's just a question of to what degree can you delay that, and to what degree can you control and contain that through good protection, detection, and response.
So obviously, Casey, a lot of the conviction that you outlined here, you've been able to parlay that into creating the business model for bug bounty as a service. Now, let me get a little bit more precise around the question I have for you around the hacker mindset for starting a business. Obviously, you've had to convince the bounty hunters that the model that you've developed or proposed is a good model. At the same time, you've had to convince your buyers that's a safe model, right? Because you're dealing with the crowd. And last but kind of more importantly, you've also had to convince your investors that this is a scalable model. So how has being a hacker early on in your career helped you kind of crack this code of business, so to say?
Yeah, I think curiosity supports, just having a voracious appetite for learning in terms of, how does venture financing work? What are the motivations of a VC? What does it look like to raise a Series C, Series A, Series B, so on. Prior to going into that, I definitely felt this way, and I've do a lot of mentoring and advisory stuff for entrepreneurs now. And it's a question that comes up a lot. I think people view that whole process almost as this like black box that you throw pitch decks at, and one day a check kind of spits out. And that's not true. Like it's a business in the same way that the venture that I wanted to create is being able to basically sit and understand those rules, and then to figure out really how to use them, like how to actually work with them. Exploit, I think, would be the technically correct word. It has a poor connotation, I think, in this context. But it's like, how do you understand the construct of the business models and the business environment that you're dealing with, and figure out how to exploit it to be able to get from where you are to where you want to be. That mindset fundamentally is exactly the same as attacking a network. Like when you think about the phases of a penetration test, or even like a live intrusion, you're doing your footprinting first. You're understanding. You've got all this background context around the technologies that you're more comfortable with than others, and all those different things. Then you do your footprinting to understand what's there. You work out where the best points of entries are. You go in. You are successful in that entry. You laterally move. You exfiltrate. You pivot. You build persistence. There are analogs to all of those different phases, I think, in entrepreneurship and company creation. And it applies right across the board. To your point, you mentioned, I kind of went straight to the VC thing because I think that's generally, and I even said it just then, black box. Like that's a testing euphemism that we use a lot as well. Same thing applies to customer development, understanding problem solution fit, building out and solidifying product market fit. It's really just a lot of listening and a lot of learning, and then a lot of testing and execution and doubling down on the things that work best. For the community, I think it was a little different. Obviously, there's still, you're exactly right in terms of it being a balancing act. And we definitely, I think one of the things I'm most proud of with this whole category that Bugcrowd basically initiated is that we've I think at this point irreversibly corrected or helped to correct the perception of what a hacker actually is in the market. Prior to starting, we were either just not understood at all or feared. The idea that you could be a hacker and actually be here to contribute meaningfully and positively was a fairly foreign concept to people, and now I think it's a fairly common one. So, even that, like that's an issue of making hackers feel comfortable to rock up and do this stuff. It's an issue of making VCs happy with funding the idea and customers happy with purchasing it. So, there's a lot of analogs there, and I think it's honestly, I absolutely adore working with cybersecurity entrepreneurs just because of that mindset. It's like if you can see all of the risks that's out there, and have a pragmatic view of that, in the sense that it's actually pretty fragile and a little bit scary, but you can actually see that as an opportunity to develop a solution that's going to improve things and view that with optimism and tenacity, then you're the kind of person that I want to be spending time with.
Right. And what I'm taking away from this is I'm going to try and kind of really simplify it, because you're saying that, look, things are a black box. And once you look at a black box, it's very intimidating. But if you inverse your perspective, which is you just say, look, how does this thing work? Whether it's how does a VC work? How does the crowd get motivated? How do my customers look at the problem statement? It becomes very easy to find a solution, is what you're telling me.
It becomes very motivating. Sometimes it's difficult and it takes work, but it's motivating. And more often than not, I like what you said there about inverting it, because I think the traditional view of a black box is I don't know how this thing works. The hacker mindset is looking at a black box and thinking the person who created this doesn't know fully how this thing works. And I now have an opportunity to figure that out. So it's pretty cool like that, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that at least I'm going to focus on going forward is from a connotation point of view, hackers being heroes, exploitation not being a bad thing is something that at least I'm going to keep at the back of my head when I start talking about or start thinking about hacking. So I think it's a good conversation. Let me kind of turn the question a little bit inward now. And I'm pretty sure you get asked this all the time. We know for a fact that organizations today struggle with hiring security resources in their teams because they're so few in number. I also think that security personnel, however good they may be, once they're brought into the organization, they get indoctrinated, they get bogged down by processes, procedures, reporting, yearly appraisals, all of that, and invariably they lose their edge and creativity. So my question to you is, how do organizations then develop that hacker mindset of taking a step back, inversing your perspective and saying, how does this thing work? Let me take the time, let me invest the time to figure out how it works. How do organizations continue to develop that hacker mindset and keep that hacker mindset fresh? Now, before you answer that question, I want to throw in one additional kind of perspective for you to chew on. One of the ideas that I've been discussing with a few of our customers, because I get thrown this question quite a bit, one of the ideas I've been discussing with our customers is, look, guys, you already have QA engineers within your organization. They're halfway there. Why don't you skill them up to make them great hackers? I don't know if you agree with that perspective, but I'll just throw that out there as you kind of wrap this whole thing in your answer.
Yeah, for sure. So, the first place to look is internal, and keeping in mind, so we're talking about the hacker mindset specifically as it relates to security. I'm not just thinking about people that can do security focused quality assurance. It's actually the folks that are going to try to innovate in this space and really try to almost get the train to jump its tracks in terms of the any kind of ruts in thinking or mental models that might be contributing to risk within an organization. That's the kind of person that I'm thinking about and looking for, and the kind of transference I think that we've talked about before, and internally is always, I think, the first place to look. Being able to encourage folk. I'm a massive fan of the idea of security champions. I'm really glad that that's becoming a thing. Because security is not just an engineering problem; it's something that can be affected by G&A or sales or marketing, all sorts of different areas of the business where it is possible to introduce technology risk. I think that's only becoming more true over time. So to have people in each of those teams that might not necessarily be on the security payroll as such, but is the person that knows the security stuff, quote unquote, within that group. The easiest way to scale that, I think, as an initial pass is just to see who's there. There's almost always people in a team that have a really strong curiosity for this stuff and have either a hacker mindset that's developed or an appetite or curiosity to build it, who would put their hand up if you do something like we want to do security brown bags, we're going to teach everyone lock picking, or the basics of lock mechanics over lunch one day. Who shows up to that? Those people are probably the ones that have their own kind of intrinsic drive to get better at this stuff. And I think that's always the best place to start. If you can kind of tap into that internal motivation, then you're off to a rolling start instead of trying to start from a standing position. So that's the internal side. And then externally, I look at it in terms of, you made a good call out before around trust of the hackers because they're in quote unquote the crowd. The reality that businesses are in today is that they're already doing it. They're just not getting the reports, right? If you're on the internet, you're already basically at a point where you've invited anyone on the internet to connect to your stuff and use it as a customer, but also to potentially try to abuse it or find what might be wrong with it from a security standpoint. That's happening anyway. So the idea of kind of almost accepting that as a kind of default state, and instantiating a vulnerability disclosure program where if there is something that's discovered, it's like neighborhood watch for the internet. If you see something, you say something, you make sure that it's easy for people to say that to the right place, and for them to understand what you're okay with, what you're not okay with, what they can expect from a response standpoint, and different things like that. This is distinct, by the way, from a bug bounty program. Those two terms get confused all the time, and it drives me insane. A bug bounty is essentially a vulnerability disclosure program where you've added cash as a reward and incentive to get people to continue to come back. But the base thing that I think is pretty quickly becoming just a standard part of expected behavior on the internet is a VDP, a vulnerability disclosure program. And it's basically what I just said. It's a policy and a channel for people to communicate to you from the outside in. That's not only a good thing to do, I think, just from a hygiene and from a even corporate social responsibility standpoint, it does start to transfer some more of this sense of what the hacker mindset looks like. And even, belief in the boogeyman, right? You have your red team discover a vulnerability and tell an engineering team about a thing they need to fix. That's one thing. But if you have someone come in from halfway across the planet and say, hey, I found a problem, the impact of that in terms of, realization that, this is a thing that can happen. I need to actually take security more seriously, within the engineering department or DevOps or wherever else. It impacts them in a completely different way. So I think that's a very powerful thing to do.
I agree. I think the optics of that is very powerful. Just a quick sidebar here. You got me thinking, right? When you were differentiating between the VDP and the bug bounty program, you talked about aspects of the payout, but also there are aspects of a process, right? You've kind of enforced a minimal process, if that may be, on the crowd. Now, the sidebar here is, do you actually have to go do some extra work to keep the hackers or the crowd curious, right? Because the motivations for the crowd are changing ever so slightly as the cash reward continues to increase, ever so slightly as the reporting requirements continue to increase.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good way of framing it in terms of motivation. Like VDP, the intention of it is for it not to be seen or used as a way to motivate people to do testing or submit issues. It's almost like a lightning rod. Like you're not motivating lightning to do something. You just know it's a thing that'll happen sometimes. So you want to get it to the right place, so that you avoid damage and so that you can deal with it. That's really how I see VDP. If you want to go further with the lightning analogy, a bug bounty is like rocket triggered lightning. When you fire a rocket up into the sky when you think lightning's about to hit, and actually try to encourage it to happen in that sort of way. So that's a distinction, I think, in the motivations between those two things. And you're absolutely right with a bug bounty program. Again, I'm full of analogies because I'm a security person and we need to be able to explain stuff to people. So here we go again. It's almost like a fireproof safe. When you're going out looking for something like that in a supermarket or a store, they're not fireproof. If you threw that thing into the sun, it would still burn, right? So what it really is a fire resilient safe. And what they'll have on them is this idea of it being rated for a certain period of time at a certain temperature. That's kind of like the temperature is kind of like the rewards that you set as an organization. What we usually see is someone start at a particular level. They'll have this set of vulnerabilities that'll come in through the initial wave as they're kind of clearing some assurance debt. People will do research, stuff will continue to trickle in, and then at some point in time, the velocity will start to drop off because you've hardened the targets that are under test at that point. So for the people actually doing research on it, the people hacking on it, the motivation for them isn't quite as high because it's not as rewarding to test that thing based on the reward that you've got set out and available for them. So at that point, it's like, hey, congratulations, that's actually a good thing. You've graduated. You now should increase your rewards to drive people deeper into your systems, but also to expand, I guess, the audience that's potentially interested in your program. And you can see how that maps back to the fire safety thing, or the fire resilience thing. You've gone from 1400 degrees Fahrenheit to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit at that point, and that's actually a good thing.
Right. So there is a feedback loop of sorts, and maybe this is that invisible feedback loop that needs to be brought to the fore, where organizations need to start looking at their products as graduating to the next level of security, which means they've got to up the price for the crowd to come in and discover harder to find issues. I think that's kind of the feedback loop that you're talking about.
Exactly. You've succeeded in building your fence tall enough to deter the kind of attacker that you expect the most. Here's the next, set of attacker that, for which that fence might not be sufficiently tall. Here's like how we're going to test whether or not that's true and give you feedback on where you need to improve it. It's that whole kind of feedback loop where economics actually play a pretty key role in continually improving your resilience over time.
I'm surprised how we've kind of come a full circle here. We started off talking about the economics of the adversary, and we're talking about the economics of making your application or your system under test more secure.
Yeah, they're a mirror image of each other. I think the only thing that's different with the adversary is that they're using they're finding a vulnerability, they're weaponizing it, and actually creating a product from it. And they want that product to continue to be functional for whatever reason it's being used, right? That throws things out a little bit, although there's similarities even there with the fact that the stuff we're defending is also a product that we're trying to keep valuable to our customers at the same time. There are I think a lot of parallels. Honestly, this is a design principle that I try to follow, and it's one that it doesn't always work, but when it's possible, it's great. When you can sort of see the symmetry map between both sides of the equation, if that's possible, then you can start to figure out ways to balance it out. And there's a lot of power that comes from doing that, I think.
Absolutely. Economic transference, if that's a thing.
Exactly.
All right, Casey, one final question before we kind of end today's conversation here. And this one's a loaded question, right? Are you born a hacker or can you learn the skill?
Both. That's my loaded answer. I think I think there are certain types of wiring, even from a neurodivergence standpoint. Not just that, like there's just people that are just born with a curiosity and kind of a reward model in how they're wired up as a human that's more conducive to them, figuring out how to tear technology apart and put it back together. I think, some people have like a backstory. So that's the nature side. I think on the nurture side, some people have a backstory that kind of gets them into a position where they're thinking about these sorts of things instinctively almost, or as second nature. Both of those two examples are folks that I think, would be categorized as born a hacker, quote unquote. I'd consider myself firmly in that camp, right? But I've seen people who have this curiosity. They get this kind of glint in the eye. They might not necessarily know how to do anything yet, but they're fascinated. They're kind of leaning in and wanting to learn more. I've seen incredible success from people that have basically just applied themselves, against that curiosity, run with that instinct, and actually become very competent. Security engineers, hackers, like all sorts of different variations of how that actually expresses itself. But that core mindset of I'm going to think basically opposite and try to find ways to prove whether or not that's true and then create value from that. I think it's something that you can learn also.
Yeah, and I think if we can help people understand that the inverse of the black box is just a simple question, how does something work or how is it designed to work? That breeds a lot of curiosity. I agree.
Yeah, it breeds a lot of curiosity, I think, in some people, like hackers and hacking and all of that. This is something that we've really used quite a bit with Bugcrowd, just almost exploiting the mystique and the curiosity, the fascination that people have with this space because it's interesting. And I honestly think, the hacker community kind of enjoys being interesting as well. So fine, like that gives us something to work with. I think that's actually a really positive thing. Not everyone has interest in it to the point where they'll actually, do the hard work and start to really learn stuff. So I think those folk might have a hard time, but everyone else, I think, can do it.
Perfect. Casey, you know what? I've really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you did too.
Yeah, likewise. Appreciate it.
All right. Hey, look, thanks for coming on the show. Folks, that is a wrap for this month's episode. Before I sign off, a huge shout out to our producers, Lauren and Herman. Till next time, stay safe and take care.
Thank you for listening to White Hat Security's AppSec Stats Flash podcast. To learn more, download the report or visit us on the web at www.whitehatsec.com.